Welcome to another episode of Soul Talk. It's been a while. We're back
Mhm.
because we want to talk about service today. I'm here with Jenna and Nino. And if you haven't caught our previous two episodes on presence and devotion, I encourage you to, because it just feels like soul medicine when it
Mhm.
comes forward. And so that's what we really want you to do today when you're listening to this is just receive this as soul medicine. Don't get too much in your head. Just kind of receive the frequency, the vibration of what's coming through and allow it to just kind of speak through you, whether it's through sensations in the body, emotions that come up. Just be present. Present. If you want to tune into our second episode of Presence, that'll help you with that. Um, be present with what's coming forward so that you can really receive the transmission and frequency and an energy as we're talking today. Because in this conversation about service, we're going to be stretching this beyond just like the tangible understanding of service. And that's what I really love about these conversations is that we play with not just the concrete ways that presence, devotion, service show up in our lives, but we also talk about, the energetic underpinnings of this and the spiritual source points of these things. And so we're going to kind of play in the quantum and play in the 3D. So strap yourself in, get ready for the ride. And let's start today by just talking about when we talk about the concept of service, what immediately comes up? Like what pops in for you when I say that?
Okay, I'll go first. What immediately comes into my head is extension of self and source is the first thing that comes into my head because all of service is allowing source to express through you. So, and I feel like when we allow that, everything extends from there. It's not about a tangible thing necessarily or like what you want to make of your service. I think a lot of people get caught up in the idea of wanting to like save the world, and just attributing service to that and then not knowing how to do it because it comes this like ethereal thing that you can't quite grasp. And so I think that when you really just go within and do what moves you, that is a natural extension of your service. And then it comes to form and clarity much quicker. And then it feels much more authentic that way. What you got?
And you took the word that I was going to use. Authenticity as service is what came to mind for me. Realizing that there's nothing that we have to concretely decide to do other than to be ourselves, to be of service, because our service is already encoded within who we were made to be. It's in our DNA, it's in our psyche, it's in our natural embodiment. And a lot of people, even myself, like I started all of this wanting to be of service and thinking that meant I had to do something particular, um, and that it had to look a certain way. But service is just being yourself because God, source, is already in us. And when we allow ourselves to be exactly what source called us to be, meant for us to be more connected to that origin point, we are already in service. We are already um, gifting the world with what it needs at this point. And so there's nothing that we have to do. It's everything that we get to do and get curious about. Like Jenna said, following our deepest desire, following our deepest curiosity will lead us to what is meant for us to offer to the people in our space. And that is running currents throughout, you know, life and something that you do, you know, for 5 minutes. It took you 5 minutes to do something from your authentic curiosity and truth can have a lasting impact on somebody 15 years from now. And we will never know it. And it's being okay with not knowing how we impacted somebody that changes, I think, the tonality of what it means to be of service.
I love that. I love that. I want to comment on a couple of things you guys said, but I will start first. We'll get into a chat about it in a second, but I will start first by defining it for myself. To me, service feels like inviting the divine to sculpt me. And I think that that means like sculpt me in my authentic self, like you were talking about, Nino, because authenticity is ever changing. And so I think that like when you said, we don't have to concretely decide to do anything than be ourselves. And I think that the only concrete decision that comes in there is the decision to be in devotion. Right? Another plug for our first episode there. But it's that decision to be in devotion. And I think that's where the mind and that's where the human can come into play, right? Because I think that when we're in service and I invite myself to be sculpted, it's not just that I do it once. It's that every single day I invite myself to be sculpted, not just moved through, but sculpted into the vessel that it is moving through as well, right? Because that's always shifting and changing and expanding. And so for me, it is because in that embodiment, that's going to keep evolving, right? My embodiment is going to keep evolving. Like you said, you know, the service is encoded into who we were meant to be. Yes. And I think that we can actualize that or not actualize that based on our free will. And that's where the decision making around devotion comes in, and around the invitation to source, for having source sculpt us and evolve this embodiment is so important. Because as we evolve in it, I can say that my service 20 years ago is very different than my services now, even though the codes were still there. You know what I mean? And so I think that service also can feel, just from like a textured space, it feels soft to me, right? Like service, when we just think of the word, it feels soft. But what I really like about this sculpting piece is that it's not just soft, it's like this demonstrative presentation of who I am. Not necessarily how I'm serving, but who I am. And I think that people could probably come up with this space of like, well, what about these collective things that are going on, right? Like the wildfires, like the war, like the hurricanes, like all of these things that are happening on a collective level. And it feels like a bypassing to kind of come into this space of, well, I'm going to allow myself to be sculpted, because in that I'm allowing myself to be moved. I'm inviting movement. It's not like I'm just sitting back and getting sculpted and like appreciating my chiseled abs, right? Which, by the way, is not happening. So I might need to talk to Source about that. But truly, like it's in that, recognizing that natural movement is somewhere I will be guided, right? And it is my choice to move with it. And the more that I commune and devote, the more I am going to feel the subtle urgency and nuances and tuggings of that mission, right? Because everybody's mission is different. And I think that Jenna pointed out too, like this save the world mentality, right? And I think that for me, I feel, savior mentality is definitely more about yourself than it is about the collective. But I also think that we can have this urgency to kind of fix the collective. And a lot of that comes from a fear standpoint. And I want to hear your thoughts on this though, because I've been talking for a little bit now and I kind of want to see what's popping up for each of you. Jenna, what you got?
No, I'm just feeling into the concept of the service of the collective, and then trying to take all of that on. Because that just feels like misplacing where you feel momentum. Because you want to serve, you want to do, you want to act, right? And you feel that urge or that pull or the pressure. And so you place it somewhere that almost feels more difficult to obtain, and then it gets chaotic and it gets frenetic. And I think that a lot of people do that because they don't, again, know necessarily where they want to serve, and they don't tap into that authenticity of self. So it just kind of spreads And then I think that that's how people get kind of stagnant in service, is because they just feel the momentum and then they go, oh, you know what I mean? I don't know. I want to be with that for a second, though.
Yeah, that's interesting because I feel like that's such a good point. It's making sure that you're, of course, we all desire to shift the collective
Mm.
when we're on this path. If you're listening to this, of course you have a big heart and you desire to be of service on a grander scale. But I think that I like this concept of misplacing momentum because the bottom line is, yeah, there's a response to pressure. And I think there's the discernment. There's the nuance. Because I think anytime that we're moved to serve, there is a sensation of pressure. Not every time. Sometimes it's just this like momentous desire, right? But it can feel like pressure if we're being pushed somewhere, right? Invited somewhere magnetically, because magnetism is very pressuring. It's very, very bold, very strong. You can feel it when you're in an MRI, right? Like it's just, you can feel that pressure. And so I think that's where the discernment could come in, is that when we're in communion with source, when we are in the quantum space, the actual pure energetic space, we can discern between the pressure that we're feeling from a nervous system frenetic standpoint and the pressure that we're feeling from a more quantum standpoint that has cleaner edges. Does that make sense?
Yes. And then they're placed differently. Like once you have that discernment, then you can say, okay. And they feel different in your body, I think, as well. Because like we said once, like that conversation of truth being full bodied, right? And so
Yep.
it just feels different rather than feeling like pressure in one space and then making it feel more mind heavy of what do I do? Or what do I do with this momentum? What do I do with service? And it's like, no, you don't have to do anything with service. You just have to be.
Yeah, I love that. Nino, are you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, a couple of things that came up when Jenna was talking about misplacing where you feel momentum. Um, for me, I started thinking about like this is where we tend to hide. We select to serve in this really huge capacity, like the collective issues that we're going through. And it's almost hiding from where we can be of true service because it's so big and grand that we allow the fear to enter into that space. And then we collapse into it. And we start to distrust our own service, our own authenticity, where service, and I hate to use, could, should, would, but service should be from a place of excitement. A, that momentum is excitement because you're like, oh, this is where I'm being called. This is where I can be fully in what I'm meant to be, rather than displacing into a place where you're like, I'm not sure that I can actually serve here, but I'm going to throw myself into this service from a place of like fear of success or fear of failure. Either one of those can cause us to go into something that feels too big for us. And we use that to mean something about what we're capable of doing in service to others. So for me, I think when I feel into being of service in the collective, it's more about knowing local before global. It starts with me. It starts with me being of service to the source point within me, that devotional and presence within myself, and hearing, like you said, Laura, that nuance, those whisperings of where is my highest joy? Where is my highest excitement here? And then letting that lead you, letting source and your own encoding to lead you into going further out. And like I said earlier, I can serve one person who feels very local, just within my community, and I don't ever know how far that will ripple. And I don't have to know that. I can just trust that Source has called me to serve in this way, and I don't need to see the big picture. All I need to do is give my yes.
I think there's a lot of humility in that as well, that people don't like to, um, you know, because people like to be, and I mean, I'm guilty of this as well, but it's like people like to be the exception, right? They want to be extraordinary.
Yeah.
So you want to take on a quote unquote bigger role or take on a something that feels more momentous, and like you're not truly tasting the momentum that you're being given by Source, and you're taking that and you're writing it somewhere else, and you're trying to direct it elsewhere because you want to be more. You want to get, and that can still come from a heart-centered space of wanting to give more and be more. But at that point, you're directing it more so, I want to say, yeah, with the mind, but also with a desired outcome, as opposed to receiving what you're being given from Source and then being, humbled um, to what you're being called to.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jenna, the way that you said that, it definitely made me think of like as humans, we desire that external validation, and part of trusting our own service and trusting our own gift is to receive that external validation that yes, I'm making a difference and an impact in the world with my service. And I think that, you know, when we compare our work to, the thousands of people that are online, especially now that we have such a huge online space talking about being of service and their spiritual works and all this stuff, it can give us this discomfort, dis-ease, and distrust in our own service when it's not validated. And so I think part of, like you said, choosing something bigger that will be seen, that will be heard and remembered, yeah, it comes from a place of not being humble and knowing that what Source has for me in my design for service doesn't have to look like anybody else's. And it can still be deeply beneficial to many people, and I'll never, like I keep going back to, I'll never know it. And we have to be okay with not knowing.
There's a couple things coming up in this for me. I love this concept of the fact that we won't know, because yes, we won't know. And that truly just brings it back to your own field, right? Being present within your own field. And also, when you're connected to Source, you're automatically connected to everything that is. And so, of course, you're going to receive those energies as they are meant to come through that design, right? And what's being delivered through you. But I think two things came forward for me here. Jenna, you were talking about people like to be the exception and extraordinary. And I think that is the case sometimes. And I also think that this can also be a very collective conditioning thing where, like, for instance, we talk about, you brought up comparison, Nina, which is funny because I had just been thinking about that while Jenna was talking, where it's like she's talking about people want to be the exception, extraordinary. I also think that they're trying to follow the examples of service like Jesus Christ. So it's like, okay, so I'm trying to follow this example of Jesus. So this is what I'm meant to do. And I'm a Christian, or I believe in Jesus, Jesus's presence, what Jesus did on this planet. And therefore, I really do want to give. I really do want to serve broadly. He did it. So can I. You know what I mean? And so I think sometimes it can be even that, where it's like, well, I'm trying to follow the example, but it still comes into this trying energy of like, I'm trying to follow the example. I'm trying to follow Jesus. Everyone tells me I need to be more like Jesus. What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? Yes, great. Jesus is a beautiful example, a beautiful example. And is Jesus's mission exactly yours? Right? There's still refinement within that. There's textures within his experience that deeply inform and serve this humanity and faith. Absolutely. But it's also not the only formula. Right. And so I think that's what can happen too, is this comparison around not just wanting to be extraordinary, but from an egoic space, but from a deeply spiritual space of, I do want to become more like Jesus. I want to be more centered and service-based, right? But the fact is, are all of us meant to serve at the level he did? Are all of us meant to serve in that way? And it's kind of like you said, Nino, it's like when we show up just as ourselves and as we are passionately driven, then that ripple effect will extend. You see this all the time with like Mind Valley, right? Like the Mind Valley Corporation just started with like sharing some meditations and some things that he had been learning in his own practice, and it blew up, right? Ashmi online, right? She's on ashmi.path. She's on Instagram, and she just started sharing her what was coming forward naturally in her meditations. Boom, ripple effect, right? So there's also like, it is not also up to us how far we extend in our service. The length and distance of our service is not delivered by us. We are the catalyst for an opening in wherever we're being guided, but the momentum and the ripple of that is delivered by source, right? So I think we don't have to take ownership of it. And I think when we get into our heads about it, we take this ownership of it, which is that extraordinary piece that Jenna was talking about, right? And like this desired outcome and this tangible piece. But yeah, I think that the awareness is so important here, because we also talk about, well, I'm just going to show up and serve in the way that I'm driven. And there's a subtle nuance in that came up for me around also being intentional about our delivery, right? Because there's me being all of me and me coming into co-creation with the divine in terms of how that is being shared. For instance, I'll give you an example. This is a brief example, but like I have my spiritual service coming up, and I also have this soul medicine program that I'm doing. And I have all of these things that are so clearly blossoming and opening and expanding in me and the quantum, right? And I have all this stuff pouring in, and that's related to soul medicine, right? But the spiritual service is first. And this is like a very minor example, right? But the spiritual service is first. And the spiritual service is all about this, like, cultivating this personal vibe, cultivating this home within ourselves, within our own field, and allowing that ripple effect in the idea of service to the collective. And it's so important for me to have people in that space, right? It's a free space. It's a space where they can just bask in divine love. And so for me, it's like I have all this stuff that I know that I'm passionate about. We talk about multi-passionate, right? That source is delivering through a couple different avenues, not just one. And so in that, it's me being intentional around what feels most imminent now. And so I'm giving the example of a timeline, like, okay, the spiritual service is first and then the soul medicine. So me, it's also allowing that focus when you're in presence to come through around source. Where am I being invited right now? Because I know this other thread is there. Which one needs to be cultivated or sculpted further within me before it's delivered? How is this landing? How does this make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. First off, whew, whew, that was a lot. There's a couple things that uh kind of came that I was jotting down while you were talking. One of them was wanting to be like Jesus and serve like Jesus. And I was reminded of, I come from a Catholic background and I still hold to a lot of those principles. And there's a prayer that we used to say a lot, form me into another Christ. We're not asking to be another Jesus. we're asking to be connected to that Christ consciousness, right? To be another Christ. I'm not called to be Jesus. I'm called to be me in the fullness of my Christ consciousness, in the fullness of my soul. And I think there's that difference between who am I in ego and who am I in soul. And becoming united with that Christ consciousness is really becoming uniting the ego and all the hurt and trauma and, limiting beliefs and whatnot, reframing that in Christ consciousness and allowing Christ consciousness that is already embedded in my soul to be the source point, the place where I actually serve and where my desires to serve and to be of assistance to the collective. And the collective can be, again, as small as my home, my community. It could start as small as just me and my relationship with God, source, creator, and ripple out from there. So I think that was one thing that I wanted to point out. Yes, we are, from a Christian perspective, we are followers of Jesus, but our quest is really to become another Christ, not to become another Jesus. So our mission does look different. And can we use his model to inspire us? Absolutely. I think that's beautiful, but it's an inspiration and it's not an imitation of who we are not. And can I imitate Jesus as far as his principles? Of course. But my flavor will always be different because I'm not Jesus. And I think that's where we all get kind of stuck. I want to be him. I want to be Jesus. I want to be Buddha. But that's not you. And God created you different with a special flavor and a special concoction of your soul. So our service will look different and it could look similar. Oh, Laura, you're like, so I'm going to set that
This
one
is
aside.
expanding me. Thank you.
This is good, Nina.
I love you, ladies. So there was that part. And then as far as the length and the distance of our service not being decided by us. Wow. It is the length, the distance, the width, the depth, and even the mediumship of my service. While my mediumship can be something of preference, of something that brings me great joy, like you mentioned Ashni earlier, her mediumship started with art and then became the poetic bursts that she created around her art, and that exploded. I think we start with what is deeply connective and something that we're deeply passionate about, but Source will use that frame and expand it however he desires. And as we follow that curiosity, as we follow that passion, that length and depth and width and height and all of that will expand as far as I continue to give my yes. And it'll expand as far as my yes is, as well as far as Source desires it to go. Right? I cannot force my service where it is not meant to go. I can deliver my service where I desire to offer it. But at the end of the day, somebody has to receive it. And if they don't receive it, somebody else will. All I have to do is to continue to give my yes and show up and follow that passion. And yes, I get to experiment. I get to experiment with the flavors of my service, the mediums of my service, and allow God's timing to deliver the fullness of that service. Because a service that I started, 5 years ago may not take off until, today. It may not have ever taken off. Like, I started my Instagram account fully intending on being of service. But God used that to expand the service within myself. And it was not meant to be of collective service. It was meant to be for me to expand. And using that, the flavor and mediumship and direction of my service has shifted because now I'm in right union with myself and my soul and that Christ consciousness that God has already placed within me of, yeah, that was cool and that was fun, but that was temporary. And now I get to do something else, and now I get to explore something else, and our service gets to be exploration.
Yeah, and I love that because it's kind of like this release attachment to outcome that Jenna was talking about. It's like these temporary things that can come in that we get attached to the form in which it's arriving, whether it's the form of a relationship, a situation, an Instagram account, a business, whatever it happens to be, right? And recognizing that it is all a gateway. It is all an opening. And I also loved, as you were talking about this, giving your yes. And I think this is where it's so important with this discernment and being in presence with ourselves and with the divine around really deeply honoring your sacred no and your hell to the fucking yes, right? Like not because you're going to be excited about a lot of things. And it's like, okay, you can honor those things and then also bring in that refinement that I was talking about earlier around what is for right now, what is for cultivation, what is, and what is the form in which this is being shown to me at this time, just from that space of curiosity. So yeah, that's delicious. Jenna, you got anything?
Really? Really, yeah, I got anything? I don't know. I think one of the main things that came in with talking about the Jesus piece, it was like what kept coming into my mind was that we have the same piece of God in us as Jesus did. We have the exact same access to it. We have the exact same, and especially from a quantum sense. I mean, and we can tap into that at any point. It's just a matter of how it reflects and how it presents in us. And yes, Jesus is a great example, but he is not the only example. And we can allow ourselves to be an example. And that's just what I can't follow all that. That just happened. I can't. I'm integrating, you guys.
I'm integrating too. I feel like deep breaths, everybody. Deep breaths, because I like this idea of not forcing service, right? Like, because it's not about us. It's about what you said, Nino, that someone still has to receive it. And so if I'm delivering something through my own authentic voice, and I've got some like jagged edges, kind of trying to fit the square peg into the round hole because I know it fits, but it just kind of, you know what I mean? Like that energy is going to distort the delivery, the receipt. And so is it purely flowing, easily flowing to where it is meant to be received, right? And that's why I say it's not about us, because it's like as we are not just recognizing excitement. I always say this is not just recognizing excitement and passion into where we're drawn, but at the same time, this very grounded, centered, easeful flow of like, yes, I am so pumped about this. And I very anchoredly know. And it is just moving. It's got its own momentum. And so I think that's the important piece too, because I think that, again, we talk about this multi-passionate piece, and excitement can also be out of regulation. And I think that's where, when we give ourselves space to really cultivate its delivery, not in terms of figuring out the how and all of the concrete nuances, but in terms of like kind of, God, tell me or show me when this feels complete within my field, right? When this feels complete, when this feels cultivated, when this feels purely co-creative and kind of has its own life, right? And it's in that, and that requires a slowing down, right? It requires that presence, and it requires this just, okay, it feels complete. And we all know what that feels like when something feels complete. You know, like you're taking a test and then you go back over the test and you're like reviewing the answers and making sure, and you might have all the time in the world for this test, but there's going to be a point, or when you're writing an essay, that you get to the point that you're like, okay, it might not be perfect, but it feels complete. It feels complete. I'm going to hand this in now. You know, it's that kind of thing. Like we know what that feeling feels like in the body. And that's the energy we're talking about here when we're feeling into the sensation of, okay, yeah, this feels complete. So speaking of completion, does this feel complete? Or do we have anything else we desire to share before we close up? We good? Yeah? Okay.
That was a solid transition.
That worked out beautifully. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, ladies, as always, I am beautifully expanded in these conversations. Thanks to each of you. Thank you for this space. Thank you for those receiving it. Thank you to Source. Thank you to the creation that is being developed within us. And we will see you again. The timing decided by Source. We're going to show up in our own embodiment here and ride it. Thank you so much for being here, friends. And we will see you very soon. Bye for now.